Good afternoon, everyone. Having stood up here this morning, I can't help but notice that the numbers in the room, and for that matter, the average age, has increased substantially. This talk is part of Academic Integrity Day. We had a morning session for graduate students that are, and it's brought to you by both the Academic Integrity Day and this particular talk are brought to you by Teaching and Learning Services. And we had a session this morning that our invited speaker, Dr. Ivan Oransky, was kind enough to participate in. Dr. Oransky, I guess, has pursued his twin loves during the course of his career. He received his undergraduate degree at Harvard, where he was executive editor of the Harvard Crimson, and then went on to do an MD at NYU. And during that time, he was editor-in-chief of Pulse, which is the Journal of the American Medical Association medical student section. Then did an internship in psychiatry at Yale for a year, and since the end of the 1990s has been practicing journalism, medical journalism, for a number of different publications. For example, he's held editorial positions at The Scientist, which was followed by a managing editor position at Scientific American, but he is probably best known to this audience as the co-founder of the online blog Retraction Watch. And I think it's in relation to his work at Retraction Watch that he is going to speak to us today on retractions, post-publication peer review, and fraud, scientific publishing's Wild West. Let's please give a warm welcome to Dr. Oransky.
Good afternoon. Thanks very much. I'm actually mic'd up, so I'm probably going to wander a little bit, but I'm now thinking that the sight lines from the back may not be so good because I'm so tall that you'll have to crane your necks. It's really a pleasure to be here at McGill, and actually two of our current editor at Retraction Watch is actually a graduate of McGill, so thank you very much for her education, and she loves it here and sends her regards. And actually one of our former staff writers also graduated from McGill, so it's a bit like maybe payback and to thank you for all of that, or as you may feel, depending how you feel about Retraction Watch, revenge on our behalf. I'm going to today give a sort of tour of scientific publishing, the way that I see it. Adam Marcus, my co-founder, sees it, and of course our staff at Retraction Watch as well. And I want you to sort of think about this as a tour. When you go to a new city, and I've actually been here, I've had the pleasure of being here several times, so this is not a new place for me to come, but all of us, of course, go to places that are new to them. And you might sign up for one of these, highlight tours. I live in New York, and so there are these buses full of people. Maybe some of you have taken these, where they're double-decker buses. They run around, and they wave at people, and we're never quite sure what to do about that, but they see all the highlights, the Empire State Building, Radio City Music Hall, all of that. This really isn't that tour. This is if you went to London maybe for the first time, and you signed up for the Jack the Ripper tour of London, and they told you to show up at this alley. They weren't exactly sure, didn't say exactly when you should show up, but it was going to be after dark. You knew that, and then you really didn't know what would happen afterwards. Don't, by the way, ever actually do that tour if that's a metaphor. So please leave that there. So I'll start with one particular sort of look at scientific publishing, one particular stop on this tour, and that is to look at this lovely paper. Some of you may know the Journal of Computer Science and Information Technology. Looks like a lot like a journal, right? It's got the DOI on it and all these digital object identifier, all the things that a journal should have. And it looks like a journal. It's, of course, computer science and information technology, so it isn't necessarily, a beautiful-looking journal, with all due respect to people in computer science and information technology. It's not an art journal. If an art journal looked like this, I would be a little bit concerned. But okay, so, and it's the name of the papers, and I just want to, and so far so good. You look at it, it was published in June 2014. You think, okay, well, there's a paper, but I just want to zoom in on the headline, the title of the paper, and the author list for the paper. Now, those of you who don't study information technology, computer science, you may have thought robots no longer considered harmful. Maybe that was an active issue. People thought robots were harmful. They could be. I mean, robots can, like anything else, can be harmful or beneficial, what have you. But really, what I want to draw your attention to is the authorship list. This is an interesting. I'll draw your attention first, actually, because I'm here in Montreal, to the very famous Francophone researcher named Jacques Strapp. You may be familiar with his work. I think he may actually be here at McGill. But of course, he works with colleagues from all over the world, like I.P. Freely and Oliver Klozoff. I could go on. You may actually recognize these all as characters from The Simpsons. One of the maybe few exports that the U.S. can still be proud of today. And so how did this happen? How did the wonderful Journal of Computer Science end up publishing this paper? So that actually has, as often the case when things like this happen, has a complex answer. So the first answer is, how does the Journal of Computer Science and Information Technology exist to begin with? Why does it exist? And in fact, this is what is known as, and this is a somewhat controversial term, but the idea is certainly not controversial, which is to say this is what's known as a predatory journal. This journal, although it looks like a journal, it wants to make you think it's a journal. It wants to make people who submit articles to it, manuscripts to it, think it's a journal. Actually, it's just essentially a vanity press. They take your money. They don't really do any peer review. And that gets to this. This was actually, as you've probably gathered, a spoof. This was a sting where someone, we actually don't know who, submitted this paper to this journal and to show that they don't do any peer review, to show that it got published. Jeffrey Beal, who some of you may know his name, and he, until actually just a few weeks ago, was the keeper of the list of predatory journals. He had, more than 1,000 publishers that he considered predatory, and again, the criteria are what they are. But he actually took that list down for reasons that he still hasn't quite explained to the world, and many of us would like to know that. But there is this concept that because of the pressure to publish or perish, which I will talk a lot about today, these predatory publishers, these predatory journals have sprung up to really either take advantage of people or sort of have people who want to be taken advantage of, depending how you look at it. But the third and sort of most fun part of this story, if you will, is that this paper was written by, and it's funny because it's robots, it wasn't exactly a robot, but this paper was written by a computer program. It was actually not even written by humans. How many of you know a program, it's a bit of software called SciGen? Anyone? I see a few, yeah. So those of you who don't know SciGen, you can Google it. You can Google it now if you want. I'm not. I teach. I know how teaching works nowadays, and I'm usually lucky if one of my students' laptops is in the shop. Otherwise, no one pays any attention to me. But SciGen, you can Google. It's sort of SCIGEN, MIT. That'll get you there. It's findable. This is an algorithm, really. Again, a software program that writes papers for you, and all you have to put in is the author list. So somebody put in these 5, 6 authors, and then this created a paper that looks a lot like a paper. I mean, you'd really be fooled. I was the first few times I looked at this. Now, it's essentially gibberish. They're sentences. They have words in them. Past that, I mean, and you really want some fun, look at the diagrams in all of these, because they have, sort of arrows pointing to one another. It's like snake eating its tail sort of stuff. And that's supposed to, this is supposed to tell you something. You have axes that make no sense. You have some fun with it. Adam and I have done this. We haven't tried to publish it, but we have a paper that's written by our dogs. Some of the best work in the field, I think, although it's hard to tell. SciGen was a response, or a sort of, if you will, industrialization, a mechanization of something called the Sokal hoax, which now goes back more than 20 years. Alan Sokal at NYU, I don't know him. I sort of respect him greatly. I don't actually know him personally. But he got fed up reading some literature, and particularly in the humanities, the postmodern literature, and he just thought, he thought a lot of it was nonsense. So he did not the SciGen didn't exist yet. He wrote a paper with all these buzzwords in it, all these keywords, and ended up getting it published, even though he's a sort of math and physics person, in this humanities journal, and then wrote a whole book about it. And that's known as the Sokol hoax. So I introduced this story. There are obviously lots of angles, and as I said, every single story that I'm going to tell you will have lots of angles. I'm choosing certain ones. I'm getting rid of all those messy outliers so that I can tell you a clean narrative, the way you're supposed to do in big, no, you're not supposed to do that, but just in case you were wondering. But this sort of has a number of elements of that. One of the other things that happened, this is a piece that Adam and I wrote for Nautilus that ran in November of last year. People are so obsessed with metrics. They look at citation counts, they look at impact factor, they look at all of these things that are allegedly proxies for quality, but that actually really aren't proxies for anything other than themselves, which I guess means they're not proxies, they just are. And this story begins with, the piece we wrote begins with, it begins with the story of someone named Haas Cartwright. Now, Haas Cartwright is another amazing, wonderful export of the United States. He was a character in an old Western television show. And, but he's also, what you may not know, is that he is actually he's a professor. He's actually a professor of bovine studies. Actually, more specifically, he's a professor of bovine excrement studies, which is to say something different. Now, Haas Cartwright was the invention of someone named Burkhard Morgenstern, who, again, was fed up with all these fake invitations he would get. So he created Haas Cartwright, gave him a fake CV, and it was sort of obvious if you actually read the CV, he included things like bovine excrement kind of university and things like this. And he actually got him some editorial positions and then invitations to conferences. Which you're all, those of you who are grad students may not be getting these yet, but once you've published a single paper, your spam inbox will be filled with these fake, and so you have fake journals like I was talking about. You also have fake conferences, because you can't, why would you want to present your work at a fake conference before you publish in the fake journal. That's really the natural order. And so what this was about really, again, is this sort of reliance on metrics and the fact that Haas Cartwright could have a field. I'm going to talk in a little while when I talk about some of the reasons for retraction about fake authorship and sort of authorship issues, which are a big problem. But this is sort of a fun story, too. This is less of a fun story, really. It was fun for us in the sense that we like good stories, me and Adam, but we have a column in Stat. Stat comes out of the Boston Globe Media Group. It's a website about medicine, health, science, life sciences. And this was a piece we did, I want to say, probably about a month ago, give or take. This is something that had happened to an author, to a medical researcher, clinical researcher, that is probably, if you haven't had this nightmare as a scientist yet, then it'll probably come at some point. So I'm maybe setting you up for it a little bit, power of suggestion, if nothing else. But that is to say that when you submit a paper, you submit a manuscript, and it's being peer-reviewed, that one of the peer reviewers will actually take your idea, or in this case, take the entire paper, and make sure your paper is rejected, because he, in this case, had the power to do that as a peer reviewer, and then publish it himself as his own work. We all sort of worry about this. We all think this could happen. Well, anything's theoretically possible, and we know it does happen, but nobody talks about it. It's like a lot of things people don't like to talk about. In this case, it actually did. So an author, and we know about it because the original author published a letter entitled, Dear Plagiarist. They actually retracted the paper that was plagiarized and all that. He, meanwhile, now has a publication in the journal, the very high-profile journal that he wanted to have a publication in, but that he got rejected from, except that it's a letter called Dear Plagiarist, which probably isn't going to get him any new grants or anything like that. But, there's just, whatever kind of bad behavior you might imagine, okay, in scientific publishing, it has already probably happened. And lots that none of us could imagine, some of which I'm about to tell you about, is probably also happening. But we're just, the problem is that it's like sort of it's an arms race. And we are never quite as good at figuring out what's happening as the sort of criminals and the people who commit the bad acts are at inventing new ways to do that. So, speaking of which, I will tell you this story in a little bit of detail. This is a piece that Adam and I and Kat Ferguson, who was our first staff writer at Retraction Watch, did for Nature. This is not a peer-reviewed piece. It's I mean, it would be interesting to try and publish a peer-reviewed paper called The Peer Review Scam, but that'd be another attempt at humor. Like mine just failed there. So this was a feature piece we did, a piece of journalism, and I'll tell you the story that it starts with. There's a researcher named Hyung-In Moon, and Hyung-In Moon, he's a plant scientist. He studies sort of the possible medicinal uses of plants in South Korea. And so, you know, this is something people study. We get lots of drugs from plants. That makes sense. And he had a bunch of manuscripts that he really wanted to make sure he could publish because, of course, that's how he would get tenure and you know, promotions and all that. So what did he do? He picked a particular publisher called Informa Healthcare. And the reason he picked that publisher was because he knew that when he submitted the papers, the manuscripts, they would ask him for potential peer reviewers. Keep that in mind. Now, that's not unusual either. Actually, a lot of journals do that. Sometimes it's almost necessary, they argue, because they need more peer reviewers. All of you who peer review get exhausted doing it, and you have so many requests, and they need to kind of keep sending the infantry in to do more peer review. So that's interesting. And then, you know, he said, oh, yes, well, you know, Dr. Eduardo Franco would be a great peer reviewer for this paper of mine, this manuscript. I don't mean to pick on him, of course, but I happen to know him. So he writes down Eduardo Franco's name and then presses submit. And the editor, let's say I'm the editor, I get this, and I say, oh, yes, actually, it's an interesting paper. I think it could work for us. I remember seeing Dr. Franco at the last plant science meeting, did a wonderful job, a very smart guy, clearly. Invite Dr. Franco, and off goes an email inviting Dr. Franco to peer review. There's only one little problem, which is that the email address that Hyung-In Moon submitted was not, eduardo.franco@mcgill.ca or whatever it is, but it was, efranco123@gmail.com. And guess what? Guess who created email 123, whatever what I just said? It was Hyung-In Moon. So Hyung-In Moon managed to peer review 27 of his own papers. Now, actually, he may have gotten to peer review more than that. We don't know. We know that he had to retract 27 papers that he had a chance to peer review himself. Now, I won't ask for a show of hands because I know some of you are graduate students. You wouldn't want to admit, your sort of fantasies here. But, I'm sure that there are members of this crowd who have fantasized about being able to peer review your own papers, right? It didn't work for him. That's why you're hearing about it from me. This was the beginning, though, of what there were, actually, it wasn't 27, excuse me, it was 28. He had 7 other retractions for other reasons, so he actually has 35, which puts him on our leaderboard, which I'll get to in a few minutes. But we asked him about this, and he said, yeah, he felt this pressure to publish and all of that. It turns out, though, that since then, okay, there have been, this was a piece, I should have put a date on this, I apologize, but this was, I think in late 2015, it may have been in early 2016, one particular two publishers, they're connected, retracted 58 papers for fake peer review. It turns out that there have been more than 350 papers retracted since 2012, which is when we first found this problem, for fake peer review. 350 papers, that's a lot. I'll show you how that fits into how many papers are retracted every year and what have you in a few minutes. But this is, again, a new way to commit fraud, a new way to commit misconduct that somebody thought of and then a bunch of people copied. You would hope that there won't be any more of these because now editors and journalists have put things in place to prevent it, but you never know. But whoever thought of this or the kinds of people who thought of this and now can no longer do that, trust me, they're on to 3 other good ideas that I'm sure my staff and I will be writing about in the next year or two, but I don't know what they are yet. because, I mean, I have a sort of limited brain anyway, but my brain really isn't very good at finding ways to be devious, or at least not since I was a teenager. So just to show you a little bit, to put a little bit of this in perspective. So retractions are definitely on the rise. It's probably hard to see even from the front, but what this tells you, this is retractions from 1977 to 2015. Do I have a, no. And then actually it's overlaid with retraction rate, which is kind of the important thing, because the number of papers that have been published have also increased. But if you look at this increase, and I'll show you some more recent data, the person who used to do this sort of got tired of it, and now this is why it's static. It looks as though, because this is 2015, as if the rate of retraction dropped in 2015. I will show you in a second that it decidedly did not drop in 2015. But the rate of retraction is increasing. And from 2000 to 2010, the rate of retraction went up tenfold. So there were about 40 retractions in 2000. There were about 400 retractions in 2010. The rate of papers going up, increasing, number of papers published only grew 44%. So it outpaced the growth in retractions outpaced the growth in papers being published. And I'll just show you, just to sort of close the loop on that a little bit. These are recent retractions. This is the more recent figures, and these are all from PubMed and Medline. That same for the last slide. Just to show you that maybe we're seeing a plateau, but it's really too early to tell. But the point is that they've continued to rise. So, we're way above 600 at this point in terms of retractions. And again, the rate of papers being published has grown, but not quite as much as you see here. And it could be a plateau. Again, we'd need more data. We'd need a few more years to sort of be able to say that. I'm not necessarily convinced we are at one. That's why there's a question mark. But the question I often get, and I think is a very good one, is, why are retractions on the rise? Is it that, fraud is on the rise, misconduct's on the rise, and I'll talk about what percentage of retractions are due to those reasons, or is it that we're better at catching it? And I'll say that in the spirit of sort of changing your conclusions based on new evidence, until 6-8 months ago, I felt pretty strongly, based on my read of the evidence, that we were simply better at catching all of these problems. That plagiarism detection software, the fact that papers are all online, the fact that you can go and we get emails from people saying, hold this image up to this image, sometimes in weird ways, like take your laptop and stand in front of a mirror and sort of turn it sideways and play interesting music and you'll see it. Usually those people have some other substance that is helping them see things. But the point is that there are more eyeballs on all these things and you can see them. And that's clearly responsible for a large part of what we're seeing here. But I'll also say that last year, I think it was in May, a paper came out by 3 authors, 2 of whom you'll hear about it again in a second. But the person who actually did most of the work on the paper, Elise Bick, she just left Stanford not too long ago. But she actually looked at 20,000 papers, in a couple fields in basic life science. Ones that had a lot of Western blots. Those of you who work in those kinds of labs would, of course, know what a Western blot is. And forgive me for oversimplifying, but it basically sort of is an attempt to see, what sorts of proteins are, present in a sample and this sort of thing. So, and they're these, they're usually sort of black with, bars of white that sort of show up, bands they're called. And people have a fairly, troublesome habit of, maybe erasing with Photoshop the bands they don't like, taking bands from other gels that look like they should look on this gel, or they think, doing things like that, manipulating the image. And she found that there was inappropriate duplication of images in 4% of papers. 4% of going back, this is going back to 2000. But importantly, it had risen. So it used to, she found a rate of about 2% early in the early aughts. And then as she got closer to 2014, 2015, the rate had actually doubled up to 4%. So there's some evidence, in a pretty large sample actually, that one kind of misconduct is on the rise. So it may not only be that we're better at catching it. It may also be that there's actually an increase. That still remains to be proven, but it's something important. So let me just run through some common reasons for retractions. I've sort of hinted at a couple there. This actually came up a lot this morning. This notion, this concept that is sometimes inelegantly and technically incorrectly referred to as self-plagiarism. You can't actually plagiarize yourself. But what you can do is duplicate, meaning you're publishing your own work more than once. That's considered a bad idea, and sometimes it's just because it's copyright, sort of infringement, which is another story. But it's considered a bad idea because you're supposed to be presenting something as original. You signed a piece of paper that says it was original. You also could be inflating, when someone goes back and does a meta-analysis or a systematic review, it makes it look as though that one paper actually was 10 papers, right? It's sort of the story of trying to make yourself look bigger in front of a predator or something like that using mirrors. That would, that's not a good thing, but it's not the worst sin in the world. Plagiarism, I think we all know what plagiarism is, although for some reasons that I'll show you in a little while, maybe it's not always clear. Image manipulation, which I just mentioned, that the Western blot problem is sort of one of the big ones. Fake data, I think you all know what fake data is, and you'll see some of the folks on our leaderboard, the people who are way at the top, that's their preferred, method of, their sort of preferred method of murder, if you will. But that's when you actually go and make it up. Fake peer reviews I mentioned, that's about 350 retractions over the past 5 years. Publisher error, this is not a particularly important reason for retraction, but it makes us laugh. The publishers, sometimes, this happens about once a month on average, they'll do something where they'll publish the same paper twice, or they'll put it in the wrong section of a journal or something trivial like that. And apparently the only way these publishers, who really should know better, have to correct that mistake is to retract the paper. So let's say that you're we wrote an editorial about this. Let's say, you're a grad student, postdoc, or, junior faculty member and applying for a position. Or you don't even know people are looking to recruit you, but they're looking at your online CV, one of those automated ones that universities often pull up. You'll have retraction next to on that CV, or in PubMed if you look, if that's where your papers are. And it's not your fault. And we do know that retraction has a stigma. They really should be able to come up with some other way to talk about it. But again, not a huge deal, but it matters to some people. I mentioned authorship issues, and I mentioned the sort of fake authors that Burkhard and Morgenstern had come up with. We see all kinds of cases of fake authorship. Well, it's not all fake, it's just authorship issues. We see people who say they should be on papers if they aren't. We see people who say, I never wrote that paper, please take me off of it. We see honorary authorship, guest authorship, all sorts of things. And we also see actual fake authorship. There's a sort of funny story. I mean, one author made up a research colleague at a prestigious university who didn't exist in order to get his papers published more. It worked until it didn't. That's, again, why you hear about it from me. But then there was a fun story, I think fun, and some of you in physics may know this story. It's several decades old now. But there was a researcher, he was in Italy, and he, he's a physicist. He was convinced he was right, and, this wasn't fraud or anything, but nobody would publish his work, or the big journals wouldn't publish his work. So he said, well, how can I solve, I know I'm right, how can I solve this problem? I bet that if I, had an author from a very prestigious university in Italy, I bet that it would get through peer review. Same exact paper. Let me see if that works. So he did that. He submitted 3 different papers with a fake author, actually, from this very prestigious institute. And they actually all got accepted. Same exact paper. He didn't change anything, right, except the author list. But he wanted people to know this, right? He wanted there to be a tell, like there is in poker. So anyone speak Italian here? Somebody must speak Italian. Oh, really? Okay, so I can mangle the pronunciation the way I usually do. If I speak in Italy, I have to be careful here. But he wanted everyone to know. So he named the author Stroncio Bestiale. Okay? Now that may be close enough to some other Romance language that you know. But what's that? See, I knew someone would know. And can you translate that for us, sir? Yeah. So basically, it can be translated as giant asshole. Okay? So pardon my, I can't say that here, can I? Sorry, pardon my American. This obviously, if anybody was paying attention, they would have seen that this was a fake author, but it's sort of a fun story anyway, and he, of course, confessed to it, and the paper hasn't been retracted. There are legal reasons. Sometimes someone signs a material transfer agreement that doesn't allow them to actually publish and what have you. We've also, and I'll talk more about this in a bit, we've also seen a lot of lawyers get involved with a lot of retractions on every side of the issue, and we'll talk about that. And then finally, a somewhat controversial reason for retraction. I mean, the failure to reproduce is not controversial, but should a paper that can't be reproduced, should it be retracted? And most people actually say no, that's actually how science works. But there are some people who have retracted their own papers because they couldn't be reproduced. Not because of an obvious, if it's an obvious error, or if it's fraud by someone else in the lab, that should be retracted. But some scientists are actually retracting for this reason, which, again, maybe we can talk about during the discussion. So I've given you sort of an overview of the kinds of reasons for retraction. This was a paper that came out about 4.5 years ago now in PNAS, which actually looked at the reasons for retraction and found that 2/3 of retractions are due to misconduct. And they used the federal U.S. definition, which is more or less adopted by a lot of other countries, which is FFP, fabrication, falsification, and plagiarism. Plagiarism, we know what that is. Falsification is making the results look better than they actually are. So the Western blot manipulation, things like that. Fabrication means you've completely made it up. So about 2/3 of the time, retractions are due to misconduct. About 20% of the time, retractions are due to honest error. And the other, whatever is left there, 12% or so, that we don't know because the retraction notices are very unclear. In fact, they only were able to do the analysis they did because we had been reporting on retractions for a few years by then. And so instead of having to rely on retraction notices that really didn't say what the reason was, or actually gave the wrong reason in many cases, they were able to use ours and other media reports as well to actually figure that out. But so if we say, okay, so 684 or 664 retractions in PubMed, excuse me, in the fiscal year 2016, it's out of about 800,000 abstracts deposited into PubMed. So, that's whatever that percentage is, but it's like 0.02, 0.01 something percent. It's a very, very small figure. Maybe it's 0.03 at this point, but it's a very, very small figure, not even close to 1%, not even close to 0.1%. But the question is, how many papers should be retracted? And I don't have the answer to that question, but I can tell you that this is another column we did for STAT. I'm sure you're all familiar with the story of HeLa cells, and the fact that these very aggressive, immortal cells can basically overtake everything. They've contaminated, cell cultures everywhere around the world. And yet there are a lot of papers published that claim to be about, because the researchers really thought this, that they're about kidney tumor cells or brain tumor cells or something, when they're actually HeLa. So the results are correct. There's no fraud involved. There's an error in the sense that people thought they were studying something they weren't. But the question is, what should be done with those papers? I don't think they should be retracted, but they should at least have a note on them. Because why would you want to be the scientist who comes along and says, oh, good, they figured out what this protein in kidney tumor cells does. Let me go do some work on it, and it turns out they were studying HeLa cells. Well, that's going to slow you down a little bit, and so somehow you should know about that. That's sort of an overview of the numbers and some of the reasons and what have you. I promised you a look at the leaderboard. And this is our leaderboard of retractions. It actually goes down to 30, but there's only 10 here because I did a screenshot, of course. You'll notice at the top, number 1, Yoshitaka Fuji, he's had 183 retractions. How many of you either, as PIs, you've published more than 183 papers or work in labs as grad students or what have you that have published more than 183 papers? Anyone? No. Well, that means, sorry, and none of you speak Italian either. This is just I love Canada, but come on, let's, No, so none of you, unless you work very hard for the rest of your careers, which I'm sure you all will, really has a chance of beating Yoshitaka Fuji, unless you really have to hit the gas on that. You might hit Joachim Bolt. It was interesting because Bolt, when I heard somebody talk about Bolt earlier today during the morning, I thought, oh, Bolt, yes, of course, I'm going to talk about Bolt. But then I realized someone was talking about Usain Bolt. It was totally different. That is no relation. They're not even spelled the same way, I don't think, no. So anyway, how do you get to 183 retractions? Hold that thought, because I'm going to tell you in a little while. I have a little bit more to say about Yoshitaka Fuji. But most of these have, you see our friend Hyung-In Moon, right, number 10. He's hanging on there. He may not stay in the top 10 forever, but he's good for a little while. Dr. Kato, of course, we heard about this morning. He's still there at number 7. But I want you to just sort of look at the names here for a second and see if there's any particular demographic information that you might glean from those 10 names. I heard the right answer in the back. So these are all men. And of course, it's sometimes hard to tell different cultures and naming conventions. You will, of course, data available upon request, I'm obligated to say, but if you went all the way down, you can do this now, it's publicly available, went all the way down to 30, you would find only one woman on the Retraction Watch leaderboard. And you could say, well, we are discriminating against women. If that were the case, I would quickly rectify it. However, according to a study actually done by Ferrick and Arturo, who did that other paper about why retractions happen, even if you account for the fact that men are overrepresented in, sort of positions where they would be publishing lots of papers and all of that, even if you account for that, men are still 9 times more likely to retract papers for fraud and commit misconduct than women are. So congratulations to those of us, with a Y chromosome. Who knows why that is? We can all speculate, of course, but all of that is very interesting information. And in fact, the one woman who's on the list is down, I think she's at like number 29 now, and in serious danger of getting pushed off by a guy who's trying very hard. So that's sort of interesting as well. The other thing people like to know about, and this is another Ferrick, Fang, and Arturo Casadevall paper, is which journals actually retract. So this is a chart, a plot of impact factor. We all know what that is. I don't want to get into a long discussion of it. It's quite controversial itself. But impact factor against retraction index. Retraction index is just the number of, it's a rate of retraction, number of retractions per 1,000 papers published. And you will note, and it's not a perfect linear, sort of relationship, regression here. Lancet's out doing its own thing over there, and Science is a little bit off, but that's a pretty good. They did they did an R squared, and it's pretty close. New England Journal of Medicine, though, with the highest impact factor in the world of any journal that publishes original research, as opposed to reviews and things like that, also has the highest retraction rate. Jeffrey Drazen, who's the editor of New England Journal of Medicine, really doesn't, for reasons that sort of escape me, doesn't like this slide, doesn't like this paper. I know this because we've been on panels together, and he's made a point of asking me to, not to correct it, because he knows it's not my data, but of asking the authors to correct it. And it turns out that I would say to Jeff, I have said to Jeff, it's a mark of pride. And I'll talk about why retractions are actually a good thing for the scientific literature. It means you're actually paying attention. The fact that you have more of them, he, of course, doesn't see it that way. He thinks it's an unfair sort of telling of the story, but again, let him speak for himself. But here's why a lot of this stuff matters. I mean, I can tell you 100 stories. I could stand here all day and tell you stories, and some of them are amusing, some of them are horrifying, whatever emotions you'd like me to tap into, I can do that. But really, it actually matters. And this is one of the punchlines of why it matters. This is a paper, this is actually the 2011 version of this paper, if you will. There was a 1999 version in JAMA, which basically said the same thing, and here's the punchline, which is that retracted papers continue to be cited as if they had never been retracted. So although they tend to be cited less, to be fair, more than 90% of the time, 92% of the time, the retraction itself is not acknowledged. So if you were, and some of you may actually be involved with lawyers or what have you, or be a lawyer by training or something, if you were to show up to a courtroom and sort of cite to help your own case, in support of your case, a case that had been overturned, a precedent that had been overturned by an earlier court, a higher court in particular, nothing good would happen after that. You would lose the case, for one, because the other lawyers would say, no. And if the judge knew that you were citing a case that had actually been overturned, you were doing it knowingly, the judge could actually sanction you. You could be brought up on sort of, bar association, lose your license to practice and things like that. Not so in science. You cite a paper that's been retracted, no problem. It is a problem, of course. It's very wasteful, and it's a problem for the people who do it because they almost certainly don't know. And I'll get to why that is. But this is one of the reasons why Adam and I and our staff are creating a retraction database. You can actually find it now. It's online. It's just not complete yet. Retractiondatabase.org. That's what a lot of our funding is for from various foundations, so that people don't do this, or at least they do it knowingly. You can't stop people from doing things that they shouldn't be doing. I mean, if you know how to do that, see me later. We'll come up with a company together. But, you can't stop people from doing, but at least if they know it, hopefully they'll do something differently. This is probably very difficult to read, but it is just a sort of demonstration of what I just told you, which is we like our leaderboards. We think of ourselves maybe as sports journalists of science at Retraction Watch. So this is actually a leaderboard of the most highly cited retracted papers, okay? And again, it's probably hard to read, but we sort of show the number of citations before the retraction and after. The number one has more than 1,000 citations since it was published. 3/4 of those actually came after the paper was retracted. Now, it turns out, we looked into this a little bit, and it turns out the reason for that is that a lot of people cite the paper. There was fraud involved, but only with part of it, with only a couple of the authors. And the rest of the paper is apparently trustworthy, so people say, well, actually there's an important finding. It involved insulin mimetic, I think. And so, they cite that, and they do note that it's retracted. Number 2 on the list is a paper we're unfortunately all familiar with, of course, which is Andrew Wakefield and et al. Claiming that autism was caused by vaccines. This has, again, been cited 1,000. It's actually higher than this now. It's more than 1,000 times. Most of the citations after retraction do say this paper's been retracted. So, to be fair, that's okay. But a lot of the lower level ones, it doesn't, and that's a problem. And one of the reasons for that, and this is a paper by Grant Steen, is that, and this is the punchline of this paper, about 1/3 of the time, if you go and look at a paper that's been retracted, you can't tell. So you can't tell in the PubMed entry or the other index. You can't tell on the paper itself. You can't tell on the PDF, et cetera. So you can almost, not blame. You can almost sort of excuse people who cite a retracted paper because it isn't marked very properly. Okay. So again, this is changing a little bit. This is actually several years old now, but it's something that we're trying to, hopefully solve with the database, so that anytime even if you've cited a paper in the past, we'll ping you to let you know, hey, by the way, that paper's been retracted now. What you do with the information is up to you after that. Okay. So let me hopefully a little bit of a light humor here. I want to show you, because I want to sort of build to this idea that retraction notice, which I mentioned earlier, retraction notices are not particularly helpful. Often they're somewhat opaque. We talked a lot about, and I'm not going to say what the name of this behavior that these retraction notices are describing is. We actually talked a lot about it this morning, though, in one of the cases. So this is a euphemism for a particular behavior that would lead to retraction. But this is how the retraction notice is actually read, as opposed to using that word. It's the word that dare not speak its name. So this particular behavior was described as an approach to writing. And so Adam said, this is an approach to writing the way showing up to a bank with a gun is an approach to banking. Okay? So it gives you a sense. This paper had a significant originality issue. It's true, it did. It's not a Freudian thing, though. There was some inadvertently copied text. In English, there is no word advertently, so it's sort of hard to tell what the other alternative was. This I won't read the whole thing to you. You can see that. But when I was in so maybe 6th grade or something, learning how to write, one of the things that my teacher said, don't use 16 words when one would do. Apparently, the editor of this journal didn't go to the same school that I did. Because he or she decided to use that many words. You know what happened, in this now, but why you needed so many words instead of just using the word because, you're scared of using it, I don't know. And then finally, here it is. Of course, it gives away the answer, but some sentences are directly taken from other papers, which could be viewed as a source of plagiarism. Unfortunately, for those of us who are waiting with bated breath to learn what else it could be viewed as, the retraction notice did not give any information on that. So that's sort of, those are some of the lighthearted things that we see in retraction notices that make them hard to understand or difficult to follow, or at least sort of cloak the reality of what's happening. But then there's a more serious issue, which is that this is the standard retraction notice in the Journal of Neuroscience. I'm sure there's some neuroscientists here or grad students in neuroscience. That's the typical retraction notice, and we've actually asked the editor at the time, there's a new editor now, why this? Why not actually say what the answer is? And he says, well, because we want to just move things along, get the paper retracted, that's the important thing. And I'm mildly sympathetic to that argument. I have to say, though, that the reason that this caught our eye was because of one case we were working on where this was the retraction notice. We published a post on Retraction Watch. Here's a notice. The editor won't say what happened. The authors aren't returning our calls. We have no idea what happened, but hey, have fun. Here it is. And one of the great things about our audience at Retraction Watch, and some of you may be in our audience, I hope you are, is that they will then send us helpful links and leave comments and things. So somebody left a comment, someone in Japan, which is where this research happened, took place, and said, oh, actually, I know why this paper was retracted. This author has been found guilty of fraud by this investigation, and here's a link, and it was in Japanese. And I then actually asked the person to translate it for me. And nowadays, since we have grants and we have some funding, we actually use a professional translation service just to make sure we're getting things right. But he was very helpful, this person, and he translated for us. And it turned out that this person, again, had been found guilty of fraud and had been told to retract a number of papers. Also, though, just in a sense of what kind of character we were dealing with, it turns out that he had also been found guilty of embezzling money that, well, embezzling is maybe not the right word, but of misusing funds where he had been given money to study cancer, federal dollars to study cancer, but he ended up using that funding to study hair loss treatments. Now, I personally think that hair loss treatments are a really important thing to study. I'm just going to lay my, my own conflict of interest there out, my own bias. However, I do not think they're as important as cancer, especially if you told everyone you were going to study cancer. I don't think you're supposed to do that. But my point is that, in doing this retraction notice, which everyone will sort of gloss over and go, a significant part of the truth was hidden. And again, as journalists, we have a bias against things like that, me and Adam and our staff. But, we feel pretty strongly that's important. Now, it's not just us who sort of thinks this is a problem and is actually addressing it. A couple of years ago, Nature, after having a number of fairly high-profile retractions, wrote what we thought was a really heartfelt editorial. We appreciated it because it was very honest. And they said, one of the reasons you see these retractions that are very opaque and that also take a really long time is lawyers. Now, again, just to say for the record, I like lawyers a lot. In my family, and I went to medical school, but if you didn't go to medical school, if you didn't like the sight of blood in my family, you went to law school. So that I'm related to half the lawyers in New York City somehow. I call them periodically. Sometimes they help us. People threaten us with very silly things at Retraction Watch. People are very helpful to us. But then, it's really not the lawyers who are the problem. It's the clients who are the problem. Everyone deserves a good defense or what have you, a vigorous defense. That's in our Constitution. Well, at least for now. While we have a Constitution. So but this was actually very important because it points out something that we had started to notice, probably hadn't noticed quite as much as Nature did. And Nature, to be fair, had been through a particularly bruising libel case, not involving a paper, but a feature piece they had written. They won, but it was very expensive and really sapped a lot of energy from people. And I can understand why they would think this. But this is something we're paying a lot of attention to. And I suspect nowadays the first thing that happens when someone has an allegation of misconduct, if they sort of aware of how the world works, is they call a lawyer. At least that's the way it is in the States. I can't say, of course, what it's like up here, but it's probably similar. However, I don't want to leave you with some all bad news, and I want to tell you that one journal, and the bolding is mine, but this journal, the Journal of Biological Chemistry, which many of you who are in those fields will know, they decided after getting really tired of having us batter them every time they publish a retraction notice that had no information in it. After 5 years of that, so I'm, I guess, eternally hopeful. They published this editorial and said, you know what, we're going to include information. And to their credit, they have definitely included a lot of information in all their retraction notices. I now think they're probably among the best journals because they actually hired someone. By the way, if those of you looking for jobs, maybe at some point, they actually hired a PhD whose job it is to look at all the allegations, to sort of hold up scientific integrity, look at all the potential image manipulation. She had one case this past October that, well, we learned about in October. It started happening several months before that where, and this is sort of, again, it's a good story. I won't tell you the whole details, but an author, people were starting to ask questions about his work. So he said, oh, there's a mistake in this one paper. He submitted a correction to the journal, an erratum. And then what came back was, well, maybe we'd like to look at all these other ones. And so that one erratum, actually turned into 19 retractions, which is an impressive record in some other way. But it's, you know, this person at the JBC, Karuka Suke, her name is, she does a really great job. There are guidelines on these things. Some of you may be familiar with the Committee on Publication Ethics. They actually do say that retraction notices should say what is in them, you know, why the paper was retracted. Not everyone follows them, and these are from 2009. They're updating them. We have our own guidelines that we've been sort of workshopping and getting feedback on and are hopefully going to publish sometime soon. But there are guidelines for these things. And I just want to put this in the last sort of several slides here, just put in context sort of the repercussions of publishing dodgy research and the sort of now ecosystem that we are living in. So, you know, we're Retraction Watch. When we launched, we were one of the few sort of games in town in terms of, you know, blogs that are, or websites that are interested in this. There were a couple others. Jeffrey Beal had actually launched a few years earlier. I'm doing something, again, a little different. But it really is like, you know, Darwin's finches. Each of us is doing something related, but eating some other different kind of, you know, whatever finches eat. I did study biology, but it was a long time ago. The point is that, you know, they're all adapted to do various different things. So PubPeer is a site that we think the world of. And I want to ask any of you, again, if you know PubPeer, because you can actually post anonymously, and I don't want to out anyone who inadvertently raises his or her hand. But PubPeer, and part of the anonymity actually makes it a little bit controversial for some people, a lot controversial for other people. But if you go to pubpeer.com, you can actually look for any paper that has a DOI or a PubMed ID and leave a comment on it and say, well, you know, and it could be, although it usually isn't, oh, this is a great paper, I think that's terrific. Usually it's figure 1A, looks a hell of a lot like figure 2A from that other paper you published, and that's weird. And then we've seen a lot of retractions and corrections come as a result of that. And it's really, we think, changing the way a lot of what's called post-publication peer review is done. Now, post-publication peer review always existed. You all know this. You have Journal Club, and you study a bunch of papers together, and then you, or maybe one paper together, you rip it apart, and then you finish your donuts or your coffee, or here, I guess, croissant, and you walk out the door, right? Okay. Well, here, people are actually doing this. They're taking all the notes from that. Someone takes notes, and they post it on PubPeer after Journal Club, anonymously. But, you know, it actually is a record of what has been discussed, and it lives, and it's online in public, and people can find it. They now have some funding, which we think is great, from one of the foundations that funds us, and we're delighted that they're going to be able to grow. And then there's sort of, if you will, focused post-publication peer review that's happened. There's a guy named Yuri Simonson. He's a psychologist at Penn, University of Pennsylvania. And he found a couple of papers that he didn't think were so great, and then he started looking into more research among several social psychologists. And as you may remember, Dietrich Stoppel, who is, I think, number 3 or number 4 on the leaderboard now, he's had 58 retractions. He didn't find Stoppel, but Stoppel sort of inspired him. I mean, it's sort of strange to think about someone who commits that much fraud inspiring anyone, but I guess in a dark way he inspired him, to actually go and look at a lot of other papers. And what he did was, and I will get the statistics on this wrong a little bit, but just, so don't pay attention to the sort of exact technique, but the general principle is, he looked at the variability and the variation in all of the results that he saw, the data in these papers. And he tried to tell, and he ran these statistical tests, are these findings, are they consistent with, reality? In other words, do they have the variation you would expect, because this is human beings, if you were to, do a lot of these studies and what have you? And he found the likelihood of most of them, sort of being real results was extremely small. I'll tell you the actual number in the next slide of somebody else who did something like this. So I think there were 4 or 5 different researchers who had to retract a lot of papers, and most of them, I think, actually lost their positions. And he did it very quietly. He would contact the universities and let them really investigate, rather than sort of broadcasting to the world, which some other people do. But he was very effective. And then I promised to tell you, and this is related, I promised to tell you the story of Yoshitaka Fuji and how he got caught. It's a reasonably interesting and I think sort of illustrative story, so I'll tell you in a little bit of detail. Because a lot of people ask us, they look at the leaderboard and they hear me say 183 retractions, and they say, how does that happen? Like, okay, they can imagine maybe there's somebody who has like 1 retraction, 2 retractions, like, okay, the department chair says, listen, that's not great, but, okay, you're doing the right thing. You did the correction, the retraction, okay, let's just be careful. You get to 9 or 10 retractions, you're like, well, that's, no, but okay, maybe it was 2 different people in the lab and who knows what. So did the university sort of go to Fuji and say, listen, you've had some retractions here, and 182 is okay, but when you get to 183, we're going to have to pull the plug. So that's not actually how it happened at all. The way it actually happened is this, and again, there are some lessons here. So he's been, he was publishing for a long time. And in the year 2000, someone published a letter to the editor about one of his papers where he said, these results are too beautiful. Now, as we know in academia, when someone says too beautiful, what they really mean is quite the opposite, right? These are ugly, or they're the worst. They don't make any sense. So they let Fuji write a letter back to the journal, and they published it. And he said, well, thank you for your concern, but actually it's okay. Everything's fine here. Nothing to see. Thank you very much, blah, blah, blah. But what he knew at that point was that the peer reviewers in anesthesiology, which is his field, he knew they were onto him. Even if he hadn't had to retract anything. Remember, this was 2000 when people weren't retracting as much. Nowadays, it probably would have been retracted right away. And so he said, okay, that's fine. So he starts publishing in other fields. Because in anesthesiology, and this is true in many fields, there's always some other discipline involved, right? So if you are doing anesthesia research on children, you can publish it in the annals of, or the archives of pediatrics, et cetera, things like that, right? So he ends up in ophthalmology journals, neurology, et cetera, et cetera. And then finally, this guy named John Carlisle does what Yuri Simonson did with his research, with the psychology research, and he does it with Fuji's research, and he finds that the variation, he sort of used a p-value, which has its own issues nowadays, but the variation, the likelihood that the results were sort of, again, real, that they demonstrated the variation you'd expect, was 1 times 10 to the minus 33rd. I did okay in math, actually, but I know enough math to know that is, if anything, that's closer to 0 than most of us will ever get to real 0, right? It's 0. And so, of course, he had 183 retractions eventually. So that's one sort of, and he lost his position, which is not atypical. But that's one sort of consequence of retractions. The other thing that we've noticed is that it's still very small numbers, but people are starting to face criminal penalties for retraction. Not for retraction, but for fraud. If you do a retraction for honest error, of course, you wouldn't face a criminal penalty. This is a story of Dongpyu Han. And this story I always remember very vividly because it actually broke, and we broke the story, but it broke on the weekend before Christmas, 2013. I was at my mother-in-law's house in Michigan, and we broke this story, and it got picked up by various newspapers, and CNN called and wanted to do an interview. And normally that's easy for me because we live about 15 blocks from, my wife actually works there also, unrelated to this, but we work 15 blocks, I can take a cab or walk up there. Not true in Michigan where my mother-in-law lived, so my wife set up this shot and I did this Skype interview, which looked terrible, but anyway, talked about this case. So I always remember this case very vividly for that and a number of more important reasons. That was a silly personal anecdote. But so what Dongpyu Han was doing, he was studying HIV vaccines, and he sort of, something happened in the lab one day. It was a little, you all know the apocryphal story. I think it's probably somewhat apocryphal of penicillin and how something sort of dropped out of the sky or out of this roof or the ceiling because Fleming was sort of sloppy. There's a little bit of truth to that story. It's not actually how it happened, but that's the apocryphal one. So that actually happened to Dongpyu Han, where he took the wrong stuff, the wrong samples out of the freezer one day, and ended up with these great results that suggested his rabbit, it's a rabbit model he was using, this vaccine, HIV vaccine, worked in rabbits because they all the sera, all of it showed a response, an antibody response to HIV. It's like, oh, wow, this is working. That's great. And that would, of course, be great news. And on the strength of that research, they actually got another $10 million from the NIH to do more research on this. There's only one problem, which Han realized soon after that but didn't tell anybody about, which is that he had actually taken the controls, the human control samples out of the freezer and, whatever, thawed them out. And then he had contaminated all of his actual samples with controls, which therefore made it look to the machine that was testing the antibodies that, that they were, So this was figured out. There's actually a sting in the lab. Hahn confessed, and he actually clearly felt terrible about this whole thing. I mean, he confessed many years later when, or a couple years later when he was caught. But what happened then was, and so the ORI, the Office of Research Integrity, intervened in the case. He had sanctions against him. But because he confessed, and also because he was in Iowa, which I know probably people in Canada only hear about every 4 years right before the presidential election, because they're always the first ones to vote in the primary. It's a state in the middle of our country. I'm sure you're familiar with it. It's also the state, the home state of Senator Chuck Grassley. Senator Chuck Grassley, who is many things to many people, that's generally true of politicians, is kind of he's a bit of a, fancies himself a bit of a watchdog, and he really hates government waste. We have a lot of politicians in the U.S. who, think the entire government is a waste, for example, but he's not quite there. But so he went after this case. He called, he wrote letters, he did all sorts of things, and the U.S. attorney decided to prosecute it based on false claims, and because Hahn had confessed, the case was sort of open and shut. So he's spending, and he appealed and lost, so he is spending, close to 5 years in federal prison. That's an awfully long time to, well, it's an awfully long time to do anything, but 5 years in federal prison, most cases, nobody even faces criminal penalties, and the ones where we have seen some, what might be considered more reasonable penalties, it's 6 months, it's a year, maybe it's probation, things like that. But this is sort of an extreme case, but worth watching in any case. But I want to just leave you with, it'll be these papers and then a story that I think draws on these papers, which is to say that it's not all doom and gloom. Bad things happen to people who, commit fraud. Most of them actually get away with it, but the ones who get caught, bad things happen. But here's the nice thing. When you do the right thing, it turns out that you don't have a sort of penalty. So when you retract papers for fraud, misconduct, and the retraction notice is clear that it says that it's misconduct or fraud, what you end up seeing is people stop citing you. You get fewer citations, not just to that paper, obviously, but to all your papers, like all of your work. In fact, to your whole subspecialty. So you're actually messing around with other people who had nothing to do with it, collateral damage. But you see like this 10 to 15% drop in citations. And whether that's a good metric or not, it is a metric that sort of suggests whether people trust your work enough to cite it, right? It tells you that. But it turns out that if you retract a paper for honest error, and you say that in the notice, that you don't see a dip in your citations. One study, and this has been replicated kind of, depending on how you look at it, like 2 or 3 times, and one paper actually found you saw an increase in your citations, although that I wouldn't necessarily sort of go that far necessarily. But the point is you don't see a dip. So that's good news. Whether it's unconscious or not, scientists seem to be sort of at least not punishing you if you retract for honest error. And we could discuss the data. It's not as black and white as I just described it, but it's a good signal. And then finally, I'll just leave you with the story of somebody who actually did that. Nathan Georgette, he's now he's graduating Harvard Medical School now. When he was at Harvard undergrad, he actually retracted a paper completely on his own. Nobody brought it to his attention. He just realized when he was doing some further work, he'd made a pretty bad error in the first paper. So he actually wrote and had it retracted. And we actually, we picked up on this. This is 5 years ago now that he did this, so we wrote about it first then. But we saw this paper, and it said, and it had like a, and the retraction notice was whatever it was, but it said it was honest error. But it also referred to this high school in Florida. We're like, wow, that's interesting. Somebody at a high school in Florida must be a teacher, right? Or, but the principal is publishing a paper. It turned out it was this 17-year-old kid. He's no longer 17 now, of course, but he published a paper. He won this Davidson Award, some big, like, a fellowship or scholarship, very prestigious stuff. But then he said, oh, well, it's wrong, and he retracted it. And so 5 years later, we caught up with him, and he's doing some amazing stuff, actually. He's working on relief efforts in terms of getting drugs to people who need it in sub-Saharan Africa and places like that. But he's looking, I guess he's going to match he wants to do internal medicine and infectious diseases. But he's doing very well. It didn't keep him from getting into Harvard Med School. I mean, I didn't get into Harvard Med School from Harvard, so, maybe I should have, I don't know, committed an error in a paper and retracted it or something. But the point is, it's a good story, and it tells us that when you do the right thing, even if you've made an error in something, you actually will not see, you won't see any penalty, hopefully. Not always true, but hopefully. So anyway, I'll leave you with, I need to, well, that's my contact information. I'd be happy to hear from any of you. That #0 is a 0. I just put it that way. And thanks, of course, to our wonderful foundations and trusts that have funded our work and made it possible for me to do things like this because I have something to talk about. So thanks, and I look forward to your questions.
Questions from the floor? Come on, somebody. Oh, Andrew. Good for you.
Great. Thanks for the great talk. So what is the estimate for the number of, or the percentage of articles that are completely or partly false, fraudulent, that go undetected? So you had all of these retractions, but what's the estimate for the number of papers that are circulating that are misrepresenting reality?
Yeah. So it's a great question, and I'll answer it by the easy and quick answer is I don't know, but I will give you some triangulation to some potential data points. So one thing, I mean, if you read, I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the work of, John Ioannidis, and he's really working more on reproducibility than fraud per se, although, fraud is a tiny little part of the failure to reproduce. He says that, most findings are false, and if you look at sort of analyses that have come out after that, depending on the field, it's as much as 2/3, maybe it's only 1/3 that can't be reproduced. 50% seems to sort of be the falling out, number in some of the basic life sciences in terms of preclinical medicine. But that doesn't mean fraud, and that we should sort of be very careful about that. That means, can't be reproduced, and in fact, you expect a lot of papers can't be reproduced because, we learn more, the conditions were what they are, et cetera. So that's sort of one big number and those shouldn't all be retracted. I want to be clear about that too. But one other sort of triangulation point, if you will, to look at this from is what percentage of researchers have admitted that they committed misconduct? And that number, thanks to, he actually was here in Montreal, not at McGill, but at the time, but when he published this sort of survey and meta-analysis of surveys by Dan Finelli, he found in a 2009 paper that 2% of researchers admitted to doing something that would be considered misconduct. If you asked them how many did something that would be considered a questionable research practice, not quite misconduct, it was much higher. I think it was 31 or 32%. So if you say that, now that's 2% of researchers. It doesn't mean 2% of papers. They could be overrepresented, they could be underrepresented, who knows. There were probably more than that have actually committed misconduct. Even though it was anonymous, not everyone's going to admit that they had committed it. So, but even if it's 2%, so what we're talking about with the 664 or what have you, and there are more because PubMed doesn't capture everything, but let's call it 1,000 just to pick a number. Out of 2 million papers published every year, 2% of 2 million, and don't make me do the math, but is something like 10 times that, right? So it's, they're probably, by that, if you look at it that way, then by that slice, there are probably 10,000 papers a year that should be retracted. I can assure you we would not report on all of them. At some point, it just sort of blurs into noise. But so, again, what the real number is, we don't know, but it's clearly a significant multiple of whatever whatever we know.
Yes, I'm very curious, how did you got into doing this thing, and why? And the other question would be, how are you approached when some misconduct is reported and either the scientist or the institution try to dissuade you to pursue that thing? There's some elegant type of approaches, invited to a dinner and anything, or a nice trip in Aspen, or menacing, but I think that would not work with a number of tremendous lawyers that have your back. Yeah. And I think being in a safe financial position, it's a good thing because we can have you doing this. So thank you for that.
Thank you. Thank you. Those are good questions. In terms of how we got into it, my wife, I was sitting around the apartment one day and my wife said, you just have all this free time. Why don't you go do something stupid like a blog about, no, that isn't how it happened. Adam and I, I'll tell the sort of short version here, but Adam and I, we'd known each other for some time. He's also a medical journalist. He writes for right now he used to write for anesthesiologists. That's, by the way, some of the reason you see all these anesthesiologists on Retraction Watch, because he knows about all these things. But he had broken a big story. He's no longer in the top 10 of the leaderboard, but someone named Scott Rubin, who actually was studying Celebrex, one of these COX-2 inhibitors like Vioxx, right? And he actually went to jail. He did go to jail for healthcare fraud because of the research, because of the fraud he was doing in his research. And so Adam and I would start talking about these cases, and I had known about retractions. When I was working at The Scientist, we used to report on them. I thought there were always good stories there. Adam and I also realized often the notices really didn't say what they should say or any information. So we thought, oh, journalists, great stories. Let's just do this blog. I called him one day, hey, let's do a blog, and he's like, yeah, whatever. And he was actually quoted early on as saying, he was quoted in a newspaper saying, we thought we'd do this. We'd post a couple times a month. Our mothers would read it, and that'd be fun. That's great. As far as we know, our mothers, well, we don't know actually if our mothers read it. We know they get the emails, but that's another story. So, we started out not knowing that there was this boom in retractions. And so obviously it overtook what we thought it would be. But as we did it, we realized we were actually part of this conversation, a much larger conversation, whether it was about reproducibility, other kinds of fraud, scientific publishing, integrity. And so that really kept us going. The fact that big foundations called us and said, it looks like you are doing some interesting stuff and want to grow. Would you like some money? That didn't hurt. And for the first several years, none of that came to us directly. Anyway, it was all to pay staff. We have a little tiny salary from it now. In terms of how do we, people do dissuade us from doing this all the time. They dissuade us about their specific case, but then there are other people who aren't involved in a case, but who sort of say, this is and we actually just wrote a piece about this. It'll probably appear next week. There's a lot of anti-science sentiment in the world right now, and showing off, the dirty laundry, airing dirty laundry, that can be bad for science. So at a global level, there are some people, not a lot, who say that. Our answer to them is always, look, science actually has a self-correction process. It doesn't work as well as we like to, we want it to, and that's what we're about. But hey, it worked. You should be proud of that. You should say, here are the things we're doing. That's almost a philosophical argument. How we deal with individual people, we do get threatened. Most of the time, the vast majority of the time, it's really, Adam and I have been doing this a while, I will say. And so, not just this, but journalism in general. There are other sites that have come up that are, trying to do something similar to us, different, but similar, who probably they're not journalists, they didn't train as journalists, and they don't know the difference between, libel and not libel. And it's a fine line, and it varies by country. And being in the U.S., this is maybe one of the few things that right now I can say I'm happy to be there about, because the libel laws, I think, are better than in other places. Whether that'll stay the same, I don't know either. But the point is that we sort of know where that line is, and when we have had these very vague threats, we've actually publicized them, because there's this thing called the Streisand effect, which, again, shorthand, some of Barbra Streisand's lawyers were very upset that somebody published her address once on one of these, See the Stars things in L.A., and so they sent a lawsuit, which then was published, and so now everyone knows Barbra Streisand's address in Malibu. So that's kind of what happens to these folks. And, we've been, again, very fortunate for 6.5 years, not any real threats. But, you have to be careful. And maybe people every now and then accuse us of maybe even pulling our punches because of that. I mean, I take that on board. I don't happen to agree, but that's fair criticism. There are other sites that, again, they get real legal threats. There are a couple that are dealing with these things right now. PubPeer actually was sued. PubPeer wasn't sued. Commenters on PubPeer were sued. They won that case. The ACLU in the U.S. actually, represented them. But it took a while and took a lot of money. Well, ACLU donated it, but it took a lot of effort. And so these are things we have to watch for. But luckily, I think there are enough scientists out there who really want to get rid of the bad apples and expose them that we're probably in a good position.
As you mentioned, a lot of the falsification of data and misconduct actually happens due to the pressure to publish. What do you think needs to happen in the scientific reward system? How should it change? And is open science and open data maybe a solution to that?
Sure. Those are really important issues. I wish that I knew exactly, if I had a perfect answer for what incentives should be, or whether we should even have incentives and what could replace them with. I would have published it and moved on with my life. I have other things I enjoy doing. playing with our dog and spending time with my wife, but you know, I don't have that answer. And I do think that there has to be a shift away from publishing, you know, the only thing that matters is publishing in high impact factor journals. I think we have to get away from that. What do we do to get away from that? I can't tell you that I have an answer yet. Adam and I have written some about this. I won't bore you with that because none of those solutions are really airtight. I do think that open data, and I mean, those are good for so many other reasons that even if they don't solve the incentive problem, then I think will be, you know, they'll be worth doing. They are worth doing. But the fact that people can actually check data and share, you know, people should be sharing data. This is something that has been a real problem recently. We've seen a lot of cases where people aren't willing to share data. We had one university in the UK that, rather than sharing data, which they eventually had to do anyway because they kept losing these cases in court, spent £250,000 to not share the data. That's £250,000 that could have been, this is a medical school, it could have been spent on anything else, and yet was spent on fighting, you know, releasing the data, which turned out to be pretty faulty. I do think there are lots of reasons to do that. Whether or not that'll actually solve the problems in terms of incentives, it's possible, but it's an open question.
Dr. Oransky, thank you for a presentation that was both edifying and entertaining. Not an easy thing to do. As your presentation went on, you reached the subject that I was most interested in, which is how universities, where, well, let me back up a tiny bit. Presumably, the researchers in laboratory sciences are almost exclusively employed at universities, although not all of them. But how do you think universities respond in terms of adequacy of process to get at the miscreants or the malfeasance professors who are so badly misbehaving? It's, as a lawyer who represents institutions of higher learning back in the States, I can tell you it's very difficult, even in a case of clear misconduct, to discharge a tenured faculty member. Without tenure, somewhat easier. How do you view that process in terms of its adequacy? And a related question, not all researchers are at universities. In 2011, there was a pretty colorful piece of litigation out west, a part of the Wild West, I guess, of the title of your presentation, in Nevada, involving a researcher by the name of Judy Mikovits, who retracted astounding claims that she had found the cause of chronic fatigue syndrome, removed laboratory information from her private employer, the Whittemore-Peterson Institute in Nevada, got arrested at her home in California. Did that case reverberate in the ecosystem of the world of retraction? Thank you again for a great presentation.
Sure, thank you, and thanks for your questions. So in terms of the broad question, and if I forget your second question, I may ask someone to just repeat it, because I want to get focused here. But so, you know, we are, on the one hand, so the U.S. is, you know, somewhat unique in that it has the Office of Research Integrity. Now, the ORI, according to its statute, can only really supervise university investigations. So, and here in Canada, there's the Tri-Council, but they do also investigations. It's a little bit different. I mean, it's loosely the same, but the ORI has a few more powers, and the NSF, the National Science Foundation, Office of Inspector General has even more powers than that, although they do things a bit differently. Our experience with universities is that they vary a tremendous amount, and sometimes the ones that appear to be doing a good job actually aren't doing a very good job. The ones that aren't doing a good job, the ones that are doing a good job keep it quiet because they're actually sort of trying to maintain a lot of confidentiality. We think the confidentiality part of it is actually part of the problem. And you know, you may have a different perspective on that representing universities, but we often think that universities sort of use this overarching blanket confidentiality that's included in one of the statutes to basically never reveal any information. We've started using FOIA much more aggressively. We've started talking, speaking of lawyers, to lawyers who can help us be more effective with Freedom of Information Act requests. So that varies a great deal, and because the ORI is so small, they can't always kick kick the investigations back to sort of say, please do a better job. But the other sort of central thing I would say before getting to your other question is, there's an inherent conflict of interest when a university is investigating one of its own. And it's not one that I blame them for. These people bring in money, et cetera. It's why you're supposed to have at least some distance with the research integrity officer and what have you. But let's face it, I happen to think, Adam happens to think, that an outside body of some kind, which is not funded, it's a completely unfunded mandate right now, it's not even a mandate, it's our mandate, which counts for 0. That's what we really need to move to instead of in-house sort of investigations, which, to be fair, often do a very good job. So it's uneven. We did a piece, Alison McCook, our editor, the McGill graduate. My wife is the Medill graduate. Alison's the McGill graduate. She wrote a piece that we all worked on together, but she really took the lead on in Science about a researcher at Harvard who actually had to have a restraining order placed on him by somebody in his lab. Now, try and think about that for a second. And it's 100 feet, which is, 30.5 meters. But he can't be within 30.5 meters of a grad student working in his lab who, by the same judge's order, has to have the right to finish his PhD. I don't know how big this room is, and I can't, think in metric because I'm a silly American. But try and always be, 30 meters away from a grad student in your own lab. It's not going to work so well. But that's because the grad student had tried to blow the whistle on what he saw as a problem in this lab, and the response from the PI. I'm oversimplifying. Please read the story. The response from the PI was to have Harvard University police actually go to this kid's house, this grad student's house at 1 a.m. and have him have a forced mental health exam, which, again, read the story, tell us what you think of it. As far as your other question, the Mikovits case did resonate for a number of reasons. Again, there are always lots of lessons from each story. It was complicated because what she got arrested for was not really, research misconduct, as you know, is because she crossed state lines with some equipment that was going to be used in a lawsuit, et cetera, et cetera. That was a troubling story because so many people believed in that, in this idea that a virus was responsible for chronic fatigue syndrome. Now, that's a terrible disease that we need to figure out the answer to, but that was not the answer. And I will say that, unfortunately, she has really now, moved. She's now being interviewed and really sort of a champion of a lot of the anti-vaccine, the sort of, vaccine autism stuff, which unfortunately is how we see. People see themselves then as persecuted, which maybe they are, but they move to that. And so how that happened and the fact that it was in such a high-profile journal and took so long to retract definitely resonated with us.
Dr. Oransky has a plane to catch, and I think given the time, we'll take 2 more questions. One over there.
My question relates to the fact that scientists don't work alone. I'm sorry. And it's in 3 parts, really. So, because the people on your list that retract 100 and what was it, 68 papers?
Yeah.
Well, obviously, those papers had a lot of co-authors. Yep. And we never hear or talk about the co-authors and what happens to them. And I want to know if you think that they share responsibility. That's the first part of my question. The second part is, if they do or don't, what kind of consequences they feel from being co-author of a paper that was retracted. And if, for example, we don't feel that they should be responsible and they do suffer some consequences, what can we do to prevent that or at least help? Yeah.
It's also another really interesting question, and I'm glad you reminded me of that because one of the things we've struggled with our leaderboard is Fuji. So he has 183, and one of his co-authors, is not surprising, he has one co-author who actually was on 70 of those papers, or 70-something. So there's someone who actually should be like number 3 on the leaderboard, but we've sort of made a decision for now not to include him because he was sort of collateral damage. However, someone just did the kind of analysis they did on Fuji's papers on all of that guy's other papers and realized there's some problems here. So in fact, you may see his name in lights at some point. But that's not the typical case. The Diederik Stapel case is instructive because here's a PI, a principal investigator who was actually the head of the lab, who was actually giving the data to the grad students. He would come in every Monday morning with all of these data and give it to the grad students and say, go and analyze it, and then we'll publish a paper together. Unless things are backwards in Canada, that's the opposite of how things generally happen, right? The grad students bring the data, and then they analyze it together, hopefully. So, that's a case where you really have to, if you know the circumstances of that case, you wouldn't want to hold the grad students responsible. In this other case, maybe you would. And so it really requires a degree of knowing. And every case is going to be a little bit different. We haven't seen, nobody's really done a study, and maybe someone will, of what happens to the middle authors, because the first and last are sort of at least, in most fields responsible. But that's something that, we should look at. Oh. Excellent. What's your name? Of which? Oh yeah, I met him with them yesterday. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Did we link to it? And I just see that. We published 4,000 posts, so good. I'll take a look at that. Yeah.
I'll keep this brief. What practical steps or recommendations do you have for researchers to avoid citing retracted papers?
Sure. Well, you can look on Retraction Watch. That's a pretty self-interested answer. But we're not.
Another one might be read the papers you actually cite.
Yes, I guess I should. I don't want to make assumptions, but yes, reading the papers. I mean, often we see, and we know some of the reason this happens is because people copy and paste reference lists from previous papers and then just put them in. And then, of course, you know that because the typos remain the same in the references. So yeah, of course, you can look at Retraction Watch, and when our database is up, you can definitely look there. I wouldn't look there now because it's incomplete. Nowadays, things are easier to find. I mean, journals are doing a better job of this. But if a paper is not marked at all, I honestly don't know how you would know that. But again, hopefully that is getting better. But do read the papers. That's always good advice, no matter what you're doing. But there are sources now. In fact, Hindawi, one of the big open access publishers, actually wrote a script that crawls through, whenever somebody submits a paper, they take that name and run it through Retraction Watch, like a back-end sort of script that, a search, and sees whether they've shown up there before. So,
ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Dr. Ivan Oransky and his talk on Retraction Watch.
Thank you all.